Before I start the list, I would like to thank Matthew White for writing the book I'm basing this video off of. This book was painfully interesting to read and very thoroughly researched. You should support him by clicking on the link in the description and reading it yourself. But this video won't be exactly the same as the book, since there are some conflicts that weren't on the list when it was published in 2012. So even if you've read the book, you'll hear about some new conflicts. And side note, many of these events' death counts are extremely varied and really just guesses by historians, since many of the sources are biased or the events are not documented very well. So I don't care if you comment, actually 401,273 people died, not 400,000. One, you're wrong, and two, I don't care. Alright, enough of an introduction. Let's get into the list. Idi Amin was a brick shithouse, 6 feet 4 inches tall, weighing 270 pounds, but was barely able to read or write. A champion boxer and a professional soldier down to the core, Amin worked his way up in the British colonial army to become the army chief of staff for Uganda's first elected president, Milton Obote. Amin was widely considered a happy-go-lucky brute, and far too unimaginative to be much of a threat, because he came from an insignificant tribe in Sudan, and he didn't have the connections necessary to cause much trouble. But in January 1971, this was proved to be wrong. Amin seized power by coup d'etat, just as President Obote was thinking of getting rid of him. Almost immediately, Amin purged the army of the Akoli and Langi tribesmen, who formed the root of Obote's support, killing some 10,000 of them in an army that wasn't very big to begin with. At the same time, he replaced them with Sudanic tribesmen recruited from North Uganda and beyond the border to Muslim territories that were more akin to his own people. In 1972, Amin expelled 70,000 Ugandans of mostly Indian descent and confiscated their property. Although this was popular and temporarily profitable, it destroyed the economy. Their ancestors had been brought to Africa by the British to staff the civil service, and they formed the backbones of the nation's middle class. Idi Amin shifted Uganda's alignment away from the British and Israeli military advisors toward Muslim solidarity instead, and soon, Libyan troops arrived to help prop up his regime. When Palestinians hijacked an Israeli airliner in 1976, they found a safe place to park at, Uganda's Entebbe airport. While Amin was basking in the attention at the center of the crisis, Israeli commandos swooped in and rescued the hostages. Of course, none of this is the reason why Idi Amin has become the most recognized name in third world brutality. We know Idi Amin because he hogged the spotlight by playing the country clown. During any international crisis of the 1970s, the world press could always count on outrageous commentary coming out of Uganda. Amin advised Arab states to send kamikaze pilots against Israel, and yeah, he was a big fan of Hitler. Many of you have probably seen this clip.
But is it true that you said Hitler didn't kill enough Jews during the war?
And he did praise Hitler for the Holocaust. He challenged a neighboring president to a boxing match to settle a border dispute, and he even volunteered to be King of Scotland. Even Amin's rumored cannibalism was treated more as a quirk than a human rights violation. Among the titles he awarded himself were Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, and Conqueror of the British Empire, but his favorite was Dada, or Big Daddy. All the while, Idi Amin maintained a tyrannical regime, among the most brutal in history. Bodies were dumped into the Nile River because the graves couldn't be dug fast enough to hold its victims. At one point, disposal proved too much even for the Nile crocodiles, and bloated floating bodies clogged the intake to the nation's principal hydroelectric dam, interrupting the power supply. Finally, as Uganda became too poor to plunder, Amin sent his army into Tanzania to loot disputed borderlands. The Tanzanian army replied in force, overrunning Uganda and exposing the truth about his regime. Next to Amin's favorite palace and the headquarters of the State Research Bureau, Uganda's secret police, they found 20 to 30 bodies scattered around the room in varying states of decay and mutilation. Almost all showed signs of torture, and the floors were covered with bloodstains. Ragged, broken prisoners were released from jails. Mass graves were excavated, turning up skulls bashed open by rifle butts, arms and legs bound, children impaled on stakes. Amin meanwhile escaped to Libya, then moved to Saudi Arabia, where he lived in comfortable retirement until his death in 2003. Foiled in his attempt to expand into Iran, Saddam Hussein turned around and conquered Kuwait in August of 1990. Almost immediately, the United Nations imposed trade sanctions, while the United States flew troops into the region and issued an ultimatum. Saddam Hussein had to be out of Kuwait by January 15, 1991, or else. When the appointed day passed, the American-led coalition opened an air attack, and 2 months later, a ground attack. The war went precisely according to plan, and the Iraqis were quickly driven back into their own country. The Gulf War perhaps killed 25,000 Iraqi soldiers and a couple thousand civilians, which alone isn't enough to make the list, but Iraq's industrial infrastructure had taken a beating during the war. But it wasn't anything that a healthy economy couldn't repair. But it never got the chance. Under the terms of the 1991 ceasefire, economic sanctions would stay in place until Saddam dismantled his ability to threaten his neighbors. Saddam was supposed to surrender or destroy all of his facilities that might be producing weapons of mass destruction. He had to shut down his chemical weapons labs and surrender his surface-to-surface missiles. Naturally, as a warmongering dictator, Saddam stalled as long as possible, nurturing the fear and respect that big weapons give a little country. The blockade was enforced by a coalition of warships patrolling the Persian Gulf, which inspected all cargo heading for Iraq. Meanwhile, with no oil exports, the Iraqi economy collapsed. Medicine became rare. People died in hospitals from trivial shortages of common supplies. Massive unemployment destroyed the standard of living. Iraq had once been among the richest and most cosmopolitan of Arabic countries, but now it became one of the poorest. In August of 1991, when it became obvious that the sanctions were devastating the ordinary people of Iraq, the United Nations offered to let Iraq export oil in exchange for credit that can only be spent on food, medicine, and other civilian necessities. Saddam refused to agree to these conditions until 1995. He personally was not starving, and the shortages gave him a useful tool for controlling his people and rewarding his cronies. As with all famines, even artificial ones like this one, the powerful continued to live quite nicely. While his people suffered, Saddam sacrificed none of his comfort. He spent hundreds of millions of dollars on palaces, building about a dozen since the sanctions started. Saddam stalled and shuffled his contraband, and was always one step ahead of the United Nations weapons inspectors, until he kicked them out completely in 1998. The Americans then launched airstrikes, which destroyed the weapons of mass destruction's facilities. No one outside Iraq knew the threat was actually gone, and Saddam wasn't about to admit his impotence to the world at large, so the sanctions remained in place. The standoff dragged on until Saddam was disposed by the American invasion in 2003. Two clearly defined classes inhabited the French colony of Saint-Domingue: a tiny white minority of citizens who had full civil rights, and a huge black majority of slaves who had none. All of the liberal revolutions following the Enlightenment had to face the contradiction of slavery being legal in a free nation. After the French Revolution, Paris decided to slip a little more democracy into Haiti by granting full voting rights to any free man in Saint-Domingue with property, even among the biracial. Naturally, the whites in the colony wouldn't accept a law that cut their political clout in half, so protests led to riots, and sporadic fighting broke out over it in 1790. Then suddenly, in August 1791, that seemed unimportant when the slaves in the northern part of the island rose up, slaughtering 2,000 of their white masters with farm tools and burning over 1,200 coffee and 200 sugar plantations. The surviving whites retaliated, killing 10,000 slaves. In 1793, commissioners arrived from France to sort things out. These were radicals, more inclined to side with the slaves than their masters. While all of this was happening, the white population began evacuating to other, less volatile islands and the United States. The chaos left Saint-Domingue vulnerable to other colonial powers, so Spanish and British troops arrived to partition the French colony. With the British Navy in control of the sea, France could not send troops to stop it. But as a parting shot, the French government declared all the slaves free in the hopes that they would fight the British and Spanish for them. It actually worked. With the Spanish forces had come an army of former French slaves under Toussaint Louverture, who became the most prominent leader of the Haitian Revolution. Then in 1794, the French government completely abolished slavery in its colonies. But a brief break in the global hostilities between France and Britain gave Napoleon the chance to ship an army over to crush the Haitian rebels, since he declared they were slaves again. Napoleon sent his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, with 20,000 men to retake the island in February 1802. After a few defeats, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who would later become Emperor of Haiti, and several other of the lesser warlords recognized French authority, but Toussaint stubbornly continued his fight. Finally, Leclerc gave up and recognized Toussaint as the lawful ruler of Haiti. In June of 1802, Leclerc invited Toussaint to a celebratory dinner, where he was congratulated, ambushed, arrested, and shipped back to France, where he was locked away in a dungeon until he died the next year. Back in Haiti, disease accomplished what the rebels could not. Eventually, half of the French invasion force, including Leclerc, died of yellow fever. Even though Napoleon continued to ship reinforcements, those who survived the tropical fevers were in no condition to contest control of the colony. As the Haitians came to realize the growing weakness of the remaining French, the rebellion intensified. When war between France and Britain resumed in May of 1803 and interrupted French shipping, Napoleon finally caved. Abandoning their ambitions, the French army and 1,800 civilian refugees left the island under a truce in November, with the agreement that 800 sick and wounded who were too weak to move could be left behind and sent back to France after they recovered. Instead, the Haitians loaded the hospital patients on boats, took them out to sea, and dumped them overboard. From the years of 66 to 74 AD, following Alexander the Great's conquest, Greeks had settled over the Middle East, where they usually formed an alien upper class resented by the natives. In Caesarea, the chief city of Roman Palestine, Greeks and Jews were always exchanging insults, but sometimes the heckling escalated to full-scale riots. After one round of riots, the Roman governor demanded that the Jews pay for all of the damages. The Jews, however, claimed that the Greeks were to blame for sacrificing some birds on the steps of a synagogue in the first place, so they refused to pay for the damages. No problem. The Roman governor simply took the money out of the temple treasury in Jerusalem. Jews all over the country rose up in anger at the blasphemy. They easily chased the small Roman garrison into Syria. After that, Emperor Nero sent a full army to put down the uprising. His Roman legions eradicated the rebels with sieges, massacres, and political maneuvering, and eventually, they closed in on Jerusalem. War was interrupted in 68, when Roman generals got fed up with Nero's antics and overthrew him, and one after another, every Roman general in the empire marched his legions on Rome to claim the throne for himself. Emperor Vespasian proved to be the last and most permanent of the four emperors proclaimed during this year and a half of chaos. Vespasian turned the Jewish rebellion over to his son, Titus, who surrounded Jerusalem. The Romans kept Jerusalem sealed off for 2 years and brought its defenders towards the edge of starvation. Every day, the Romans captured desperate foraging parties outside the walls and nailed them up in plain view of the defenders. When Jerusalem finally fell in 70 AD, the Romans massacred the population and reduced the temple in Jerusalem to rubble. Most of the city walls were demolished, but Titus ordered a short, impressive stretch of the temple complex wall preserved as a lesson to future rebels that even the thickest walls can't withstand the Roman army. The wall fragment, now known as the Western or Wailing Wall, is one of the holiest spots for Jews today. The last 960 zealots retreated to the mountain fortress of Masada. The defenders watched helplessly as the Romans began to methodically build a ramp up the mountain in order to roll their siege machines into range. Knowing they were doomed, the trapped zealots drew lots. The losers killed the winners and then drew lots again. The losers killed the winners, and so on, until only one defender was left alive to commit the unpardonable sin of suicide. The destruction caused by the first revolt was mostly centered on Jerusalem, and much of Palestine remained unravaged. Peace and prosperity gradually returned. Then the Romans tried to assimilate the province into the larger Mediterranean culture. Around the year 132, Emperor Hadrian banned genital mutilation throughout the empire, which sounds like a fine idea until we remember that Judaism requires circumcision. Hadrian quickly revised his order to make an exception for the Jews. Unfortunately, Hadrian also chose this moment to start rebuilding Jerusalem as a modern Roman city, with the Temple of Jupiter, where the Temple of Yahweh once stood. The Jews would not accept any of this, and they rose up under Simon ben Kosiba, who gained the messianic nickname of Bar Koba, or Son of the Star. The rebels were strongest in the countryside, where they built fortified strongholds interlaced with hidden access tunnels. The Romans sent 3 legions to put down the rebellion. It was a rough campaign, and one of the legions disappeared entirely. This war is said to have destroyed 50 strongholds and 985 villages. It was so destructive that we still don't have the whole story, or too many relics. Just a few caves full of dead bodies discovered in the cliffs near the Dead Sea. When the fighting was over, most of the Jews in Palestine were killed, exiled, or enslaved. And this time, the Romans made certain there would be no next time. The Romans depopulated much of the territory and restocked it with more cooperative ethnicities. The Jews were exiled from Palestine, and the scattering of the Jews across the globe began. Through 1868 to 1878, the first attempt by the Cuban people to throw off Spanish rule had been beaten down in the 10 Years' War at the cost of 200,000 lives. The next generation decided to have another go at it. The industrialization of sugar processing was concentrating the milling into fewer hands, causing widespread unemployment and bankruptcy, which in turn radicalized the poor. In exile in New York, the poet and journalist Jose Marti declared Cuban independence in 1895 and returned home to lead the fight, but he was ambushed and killed within a few months. His followers pressed onward. Sympathetic peasants spied on the Spanish forces, whom the rebels harassed with raids and ambushes. The rebels tried to make Cuba worthless to Spain by suppressing sugar production. They destroyed isolated plantations and avoided open battle with well-armed regulars. To help contain the rebellion, the Spaniards split the island with the trocha, or the trench, a chain of ditches, moats, barbed wire, and fortified blockhouses across Cuba that prevented free movement between east and west halves of the island. In January 1897, the Spanish government turned the rebellion over to General Valeriano Weyler, who was about to invent a brand new horror to let loose on the world: concentration camps. Within a month of arriving in Cuba, Weyler rounded up some 300,000 peasants in the war zone and stashed them in fortified camps, after which any Cubans caught at large would be considered rebels and killed. Meanwhile, disease, hunger, and neglect swept through the camps, killing thousands. In August 1897, an anarchist assassinated Canbolas del Castillo, the Prime Minister of Spain, and General Weyler lost his main supporter. He submitted his resignation to the new government of Prime Minister Praxedes Matios Agasta. One of the few things that both sides agreed on was the need to keep the United States out of the war. Both Spain and the rebels knew that once provoked, the Americans would simply swoop down and take Cuba for their very own. The only major segment of the Cuban population that looked toward the United States for salvation were Cuban landowners. They just wanted the war to end and stability to return. The American people generally sympathized with the rebels. American newspapers stoked the hatred of the Spaniards by eagerly splashing every new atrocity across their front pages. The United States hovered on the edge of intervention and sent the USS Maine to Havana Harbor to keep an eye on American interests during the riots in the city. Then suddenly, on the night of February 15, 1898, an explosion ripped apart the American battleship, obliterating the front end and killing 2/3 of the crew. The explosion probably started as an accidental fire in the coal bunker, or was possibly even deliberate, but at the time, there was no doubt that those accursed Spanish had attacked the Maine. War fever boiled over, and America issued an ultimatum to Spain to leave Cuba. The Spaniards refused. The war was quick and to the point. In both the Philippines and Cuba, American warships easily destroyed the outdated Spanish fleets from a safe distance, with hardly a scratch to themselves. A hastily assembled American expeditionary force took Cuba in 10 weeks, and the whole war cost the United States a mere 385 combat deaths. The Americans had made such a big deal about supporting Cuban independence that they couldn't annex their new conquest outright. They had to give Cuba the appearance of sovereignty, but they wrote clauses into the treaties to guarantee American control of the Cuban government for many years to come. Spain was going through one of its occasional democratic interludes. In the early 1930s, the Popular Front, which was a coalition of leftists ranging from moderate liberals to hardcore communists, set aside their bickering long enough to finally win an election. The king quit rather than sign the leftist legislation the coalition started churning out, which suited the Popular Front just fine, since it didn't like kings anyway, hence its name in the upcoming war, Republican. Spain had been a mess for over 100 years, now made worse by the Great Depression. Political murder had become a common part of Spanish life, with journalists, policemen, labor leaders, and priests from all parties being gunned down, blown up, or beaten to death with frightening regularity. After the right wing lost an especially notable victim, it also lost its patience with the government's inability to keep order. In league with the Falange, the Spanish Fascist Party, the army garrison in Spanish Morocco mutinied. The commander in North Africa, Francisco Franco, was declared leader of a renegade nationalist government that held scattered towns all over Spain. With the army against it, the government's only armed support came from militias raised by the trade unions. However, this tipped the Republican side from center-left to a full-fledged communist revolution. Workers seized factories, and peasants seized land. Churches were burned, and priests were murdered in retaliation for the Catholic Church's support of the military uprising. The fascist rebels, meanwhile, rounded up and murdered anyone deemed Marxist or anti-Spain. Members of the Popular Front, which were union officials, Freemasons, and left-wing journalists, were rounded up and executed. In August 1936, the Nationalists shot almost 2,000 Republican prisoners in the bullring of Badajoz, following the capture of Extremadura in central Spain. In the first chaotic days of the uprising, towns under the control of one faction or another were scattered haphazardly all over the country. Soon, the Nationalists consolidated control over the center of the country and drove straight for Madrid. By this time, the Republican government had scrounged up enough troops to hold off the Nationalists' attacks. The fascists now shift their efforts elsewhere and began to erase Republican enclaves that clung to the edges of Spain. Fellow fascist regimes sent troops. Around 40 to 50,000 Italians were sent, and at least 10,000 Germans, to help the Nationalists and to test their latest equipment and tactics. As part of this joint effort, German dive bombers helped to punish and terrorize enemy populations, with a devastating air raid against the vast city of Guernica. This was one of the first urban air raids in history, and it killed over 1,000 people. The Nationalists then invaded the Ebro River Valley, homing in on the coastal city of Barcelona. Finally, all that was left in Republican hands was Madrid. Soon, Madrid fell, and the roads to the coast were choked with the last refugees of the Republican government trying to escape to the countryside. Chaotic days preceding the fall of Saigon, the Americans managed to evacuate 175,000 Vietnamese allies, who would have been the most obvious targets for retribution. People like government officials, army officers, and biracial children. Even with that many rescued, the new communist government found plenty of suspiciously Americanized South Vietnamese who needed to be dealt with. Civil servants, teachers, former officers, girlfriends, and students were told to report for a 1-month seminar at special re-education camps. The ordeal did not pass as quickly as promised. They were to be quarantined from new society and converted to loyal Marxists. The camps were run with a sort of religious fervor dedicated to transforming these hard cases into model citizens. But first, their will had to be broken, often by torture, overwork, fatigue, and hunger. Many were kept in the camps for 10 to 15 years, working hard labor on low rations. A lieutenant colonel tried to escape from the Lang Son re-education camp by bribing one of the guards. One witness described his plan was revealed. He was shot in one leg and caught. On the next day, he was buried alive. He died after 4 days. Almost 1 million people passed through these camps. Around 65,000 people were outright executed, and around 100,000 died of neglect, disease, or overwork. Even if people weren't sent directly to camps, they had to live under unforgiving new rulers, so many Vietnamese tried to flee the country. They used all their cash to bribe officials and buy whatever boats were available, many of them barely seaworthy, good for maybe a single one-way trip, and not always that. When a border war broke out between China and Vietnam in 1979, Hanoi heavily persecuted all Vietnamese of Chinese ancestry as suspected traitors. Probably 1 million boat people fled Vietnam in just a few years, and as many as 1/4 of them died at sea. Aside from the ordinary hazards of the sea, the boat people suffered attacks from other people. The neighboring nations didn't want them. Local coast guards chased them back into the open sea, and vigilantes attacked them when they washed ashore on foreign beaches, and many boats were seized by pirates. Most of the boat people went to Malaysia, Hong Kong, Indonesia, and the Philippines as their first stop, where they waited in refugee camps for richer countries to take them in. The largest numbers were resettled in the United States, with France and Australia taking many thousands in as well. In the late 1980s, another surge of boat people risked their lives to get out of Vietnam. Unfortunately, by this time, the world classified the boat people as economic refugees rather than political ones. They were considered a nuisance and received less sympathy. In one 1989 incident, 7 pirates armed with shotguns and hammers stormed a refugee boat, which had around 130 people aboard, including 20 children. The pirates shot and killed the boat's 2 pilots and did not so nice things to the women and girls aboard. Then, they set the boat on fire. There was only one survivor, who drifted away on floating planks. Boko Haram is a sort of fundamentalist Islamist jihadist rebel group who wants to replace Nigeria's current Western-style government with a Muslim theocracy. They operated peacefully in Nigeria from 2002 to early 2009, but that changed after the Nigerian government began investigating them after receiving more and more reports of the group arming themselves. Nigerian authorities swept them under the rug for many years, so when they finally decided to take action, the Boko Haram was already militarized and ready to resist. During the start of the investigation, the Nigerian government made several arrests. The Boko Haram were not pleased, so violence erupted all across Nigeria, resulting in the deaths of around 700 people. In an attempt to free their brothers from jail, the Boko Haram drove their fuel-filled motorcycles into police stations to detonate them inside, and shot at police with poison-tipped arrows. In their desire to create a pure Islamic state, ruled by Sharia law, they commonly massacred Christian churches, what they considered corrupt Muslim mosques, prisons, stores, sidewalks, schools, pretty much anywhere where people gathered. It took till mid-2011 for the federal government to intervene. Up until then, it was mainly just the local police who dealt with the rebel faction. The federal government created several brigades and a task force operation to try and restore order and defend the populace. In 2013, the Nigerian government launched its first offensive attack in the Borno region, which was initially successful, but it didn't take long for the Boko Haram to reclaim the region. The Boko Haram's goal seemed to be to kill as many people as possible, like what happened during the Jos bombings. They detonated 2 bombs in the city of Jos, choosing the busiest places in the city, such as a supermarket and a hospital, which killed 118 people and injured 56. In late 2014, the Boko Haram took control of the city of Bama. Those unable to flee the Gwaza local government areas, which were mostly the elderly, were rounded up and taken into 2 different schools to be gunned down. In 2015, governments had had enough. Military forces from Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, and Niger began a counterinsurgency campaign. Even the United States got involved, mostly to provide intelligence. Even with how corrupt Nigeria's military became and their fair bit of battle incompetence, they have been able to lower the number of Boko Haram attacks on civilians precipitously, and many people believe the Boko Haram insurgency will soon become a minor concern for the involved nations. Around 2 to 3 million people have been displaced due to the Boko Haram since 2009, with around 35,000 people being directly killed by them, and the rest of the around 300,000 deaths occurring through indirect causes, which is how most people were killed in the other entries on this list. Most deaths occurring from conflicts don't happen through military battles or military persecution directly. Mostly, it occurs from supply chain disruptions, like shortages of food and water, or from the spread of diseases that promulgate because of the conflict, and are counted as deaths whether the aggressing party is doing it intentionally or not. When most people think of Sweden today, they think of free healthcare, IKEA, and PewDiePie. But 300 years ago, Sweden looked like this. And its military power and political influence were starting to make its neighbors nervous. In the year 1700, a teenager became the king of Sweden. The ambassadors from Denmark and Saxony came to Peter the Great with a scheme to break the Swedish hegemony in the Baltic once and for all. They figured that it should be pretty easy to beat this teenager if every nation in Northern Europe got involved. Unfortunately for them, 16-year-old King Charles XII of Sweden had the personality of an autistic kid who has over 1,000 hours in Hearts of Iron 4. After coming up with a handy excuse and issuing all the proper declarations of war, each ally attacked the nearest bit of Swedish territory. King Charles of Sweden went straight for the Russian army that had invaded Estonia. In the occupied town of Narva, Charles attacked 40,000 Russians with 8,000 Swedes during a snowstorm, which hid his approach and made his army seem a lot bigger than it actually was. The Russians crumbled and fled in panic, leaving 8,000 dead on the field. Meanwhile, 15,000 Swedes occupied the Danish capital and forced the Danes out of the war. Peter immediately began to rebuild the shattered Russian army along western lines so that it wouldn't be beaten so easily. Also, with characteristic stubbornness, Peter moved back into Swedish territory on the Baltic and began building his new capital, St. Petersburg. King Augustus of Saxony was also the king of Poland, so the Swedes marched into Poland next. After beating a couple of armies that got in his way, Charles put his own puppet on the throne in Warsaw, turning Polish Lithuania into a Swedish puppet state. In 1708, Charles took his army of 40,000 out of Poland into the heart of Russia, but the vast distances proved disorienting. At first, he was planning to link up with 16,000 Swedes under General Lohenhaupt, who was coming out of the Baltic region with much-needed supplies, but Charles turned abruptly south instead, in order to connect with some rebellious Cossacks among the wheat fields of Ukraine. This left Lohenhaupt's force stuck in the middle of nowhere, where Peter wiped it out at Lasagna in September of 1708. Trapped by the severe Russian winter, Charles's Swedish army melted away to 18,000. In June 1709, Peter and 80,000 Russians caught up with him as the Swedes were attacking the Russian fortress of Poltava in central Ukraine. Charles turned around and attacked the new army and came close to defeating it, but Peter had fresh reserves, while Charles didn't. Admitting defeat, Charles abandoned his smashed army and escaped into Turkey. But the war didn't end right away, because all of the direct routes back to Sweden were blocked by enemies. Charles didn't get home for 5 years. Since the Turks were happy to see the war drag on as long as possible, they held on to Charles and refused the Russian extradition request. When the Russians sent a force to take him back, the Turks arrested the Russian ambassador and declared war, but their counteroffensive banged uselessly against Russia until they finally gave up. Finally, the Turks released Charles, who traveled his way home through small, friendly German states. In the meantime, Charles' enemies had whittled away at his rudderless empire. Peter took the war into Finland, which at the time was an integral part of Sweden. In order to deny Charles the use of Finland's resources, the Russians devastated the countryside. Finns remember this as the Great Wrath, when the Russians looted crops and livestock and burned what they couldn't carry. As hunger set in, the population of Finland plunged from 400,000 to 330,000. By the time Charles got home, nothing remained of the Swedish Empire but Sweden itself. Charles scrapped up a new army and attacked Norway, which was a Danish territory at the time, but was killed in battle in 1719. With Charles out of the way, peace became a possibility. The new Swedish king was willing to become a second-rate power. Over the next couple of years, diplomats arranged peace treaties in which all of the Allies' territories expanded and Sweden's territory contracted. After Yemen cut back on fuel subsidies in 2014, mass protests popped up all over Yemen. A decent chunk of the population already disliked the current Yemeni government because of its influence from the American, Israeli, and Saudi coalition. And the Houthis, who ruled Yemen for over 1,000 years up until 1962, have been staunchly anti-American because of their invasion of Iraq in 2003. And the fuel price increase was the straw that broke the camel's back. In September of 2014, Iranian-backed Houthi forces took over the capital city of Sana'a and began advancing southward through the country, while claiming to now be the official government of Yemen. They swiftly took large swaths of political power throughout the western part of Yemen. 4 months later, President Abdul Mansur Hadi and his minister were forced to step down after Houthi forces captured the presidential palace, and former President Hadi soon fled to Saudi Arabia. With the military divided between support of the Houthis or support for Hadi's administration, no decisive military action was taken, so the rebellion had little chance of being easily put down by the military. Saudi Arabia was not happy with the rebellion, since they viewed the Houthis as an Iranian proxy state, so the Saudis began a military campaign to restore President Hadi's position to the capital of Sana'a. Most countries, including the United States, France, Britain, and Germany, don't recognize the Houthis as the official government of Yemen, and consider the old Republic of Yemen's government as the official authority of the nation. So they've decided to give hundreds of millions of dollars to Saudi Arabia to help fund their war effort. Saudi Arabia started off their military campaign with dozens of bombing runs and airstrikes against strategic and civilian targets. And a naval blockade was quickly set up to prevent Iranian military supplies from reaching the Houthis. But this blockade also prevented basic supplies from reaching the country. Yemen is considered the poorest country in the Middle East, so a naval blockade against a country that has to import 80 to 90% of its calories from abroad will inevitably have a famine. At least 100,000 people have starved to death since the start of the war, and it's estimated that 17 million people are experiencing acute food insecurity. But due to the blockade, supplies have not been able to enter the country. Behind Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates has been the most significant player in the Yemeni Civil War. They have contributed around 10,000 soldiers to a separate southern secessionist movement, which call themselves the Southern Transitional Government, or for short, the STC. The STC has claimed sovereignty from Yemen, and most of the south has been occupied by them since May of 2017. The STC was an independent Soviet-backed communist state until the 1990s, but soon lost its sovereignty after the fall of the USSR. They are hated by the old Republic of Yemen, but often receive support from the Houthis, since they both hate Yemen's old government. Even Al-Qaeda is making a resurgence. See that little white spot on the map? That's territory under their control. During the chaos that Yemen has been experiencing, hundreds of Al-Qaeda members have escaped prison and have done a little bit of trolling. And by trolling, I mean suicide bombings on Zaidi Muslim mosques, which killed 137 people and injured 357. If we wait a couple of years, the Yemeni Civil War would probably rank higher on the list. My guess is at least 500,000 people will die before the end of the war. But for now, at 377,000 deaths, the Yemeni Civil War ranks as the 91st deadliest recorded atrocity ever committed by mankind.